Stay away from her. Adrian Moretti's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, quiet, absolute, and more terrifying than a shout. Every conversation died. Every head turned. Damian Russo stood there with his hand still hovering near Elena's arm, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that room breathed. Elena had worked for Adrian for 2 years. She had seen him dismantle companies, silence enemies, and walk out of rooms that other men crawled out of. But she had never seen him look at anyone the way he was looking at Damian right now, like he was already deciding how to make him disappear. If you're new here, welcome. And if this story already has your heart racing, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Elena Whitmore had one rule she never broke. Don't make it personal. It was the simplest rule in the world, and for 2 years, 3 months and 16 days, she had kept it perfectly. She came to work early. She left late. She answered every call prepared, every file anticipated, every problem before it became one. And she never once allowed herself to think about Adrian Moretti as anything other than her employer. Her very demanding, very dangerous, very complicated employer. She knew what people said about him. The whole city knew. Adrian Moretti was the kind of man whose name changed the temperature of a room. Restaurants went quiet when he walked in. Lawyers returned his calls within 60 seconds. Politicians adjusted their schedules without being asked twice. The word that people used most often when they described him was cold, but Elena had worked close enough to know that wasn't the right word at all. Cold things had no heat underneath them. Adrian Moretti had plenty of heat. He just kept it buried under 6 feet of control. She had seen it exactly once before tonight. 4 months ago, in the middle of a negotiation that had been going wrong for 2 hours. One of the men across the table had made a comment. Something ugly, something directed at the woman who served their coffee, and Adrian had gone so completely still that the room felt like it stopped existing. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. He had simply looked at the man until the man understood that the meeting was over and his career in this city was also over, effective immediately. Elena had filed the paperwork the next morning. She thought about that moment now as she stood in the middle of the Harrington Grand Ballroom, one hand wrapped around a glass of champagne she hadn't tasted, watching Damian Russo smile at her from 3 feet away. The Moretti Industries Charity Gala was the kind of event Elena organized every year. 12 bulls, 400 guests, a string quartet that nobody actually listened to, and Adrian moving through the room like a planet with its own gravitational pull. Everyone orbiting just close enough to matter, just far enough not to get burned. Her job tonight was logistics. Check the seating, manage the timeline, keep the evening running so smoothly that Adrian never had to think about it. She was very good at her job. What she was not good at was being approached from the left side by a man she had only ever seen in files marked with red-flagged warnings. "You must be Elena Whitmore," Damian Russo said, and the way he said her name made the back of her neck tighten, like he'd practiced it, like he'd known it for longer than this conversation had existed. She kept her expression professional. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't." He extended his hand. Polished, smooth, the kind of handshake that took years to perfect. "Damian Russo, I'm an old associate of your employer." "I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Russo." She shook his hand once and released it. "Is there something I can help you with this evening, as a matter of fact?" He stepped slightly closer, not enough to be obvious, just enough to test her. "I was hoping to speak with Adrian. You seem like a woman who knows his schedule better than he does. Mr. Moretti's evening is fully committed." "Is it?" Not a question. His eyes moved past her shoulder, scanning the room, and something in that movement made every instinct Elena had sharpened over 2 years fire at once. He wasn't looking for Adrian. He already knew exactly where Adrian was. He was calculating something, measuring something. "You know, I've heard a lot about you. Adrian's indispensable assistant. The woman who's been at his side through 3 acquisitions, 2 federal inquiries, and a complete restructuring of his eastern operations." He smiled again. "You know more about that man than his own lawyer does." Elena set her champagne glass down on the nearest tray. "I think you should speak with Mr. Moretti's scheduling team," she said, and began to turn away. His hand didn't touch her, but it came close enough that the movement was deliberate, reaching toward her elbow in a way that was meant to stop her without technically stopping her. "Stay a moment," Damien said. "I'm sure you—" "She doesn't need to stay." The voice came from behind her, and every single sound in the ballroom, the quartet, the conversations, the soft clink of glasses, stopped. Elena turned. Adrian was 6 feet away, and she could count on one hand the number of times in 2 years she had seen him move through a crowd without her knowing he was coming. He was always visible. He was always in her peripheral field, a fixed point she tracked automatically without thinking about it. She didn't know how she'd lost him, but standing there now, looking at Damien Russo, with eyes that held absolutely nothing, no anger, no heat, nothing at all. Elena understood that Adrian hadn't been out of her sight by accident. He'd been watching Damien approach her. "Adrian." Damien's smile shifted into something more careful. "I was just getting acquainted with your—" "I know what you were doing." Adrian's voice was conversational, unhurried, which was Elena had learned significantly more frightening than when he raised it. "And I'll say this once, Damien, because I think you'll appreciate the simplicity." He stepped forward, one step perfectly measured, and placed himself between Elena and the other man. "Stay away from her." The room didn't just go quiet. It went the kind of quiet that happens when everyone present simultaneously understands that they are watching something much larger than a conversation. Damien held the smile for 3 more seconds. Professional courtesy. Elena thought distantly, or the need to appear unaffected in front of 400 witnesses. "You've always been protective of your assets, Adrian. I respect that." "She isn't an asset." 2 words. Said without emphasis, without drama, without anything at all behind them. And somehow those 2 words were the loudest thing that had happened in the ballroom all evening. Elena felt something move in her chest. Damien's smile finally dropped. Not much, just a fraction. "We'll talk soon," he said, addressing Adrian now. Elena already dismissed from his attention. "There are matters between us that need resolution." "Yes," Adrian agreed. "There are, but not here and not tonight." Damien inclined his head, the practiced retreat of a man who knows when to withdraw without conceding, and moved back into the crowd. People shifted aside for him automatically. Nobody wanted to be the person standing next to Damien Russo when Adrian Moretti was watching. Adrian watched him go for 4 full seconds. Then he turned to Elena. She had worked with this man for 2 years. She had seen him handle senators' crime bosses and federal prosecutors. She had sat across from him at midnight, going over documents that would make most people's hands shake. She had learned to read every version of his face. The closed version, the negotiating version, the version he used at funerals, the version he wore in board meetings like armor. She had never seen the version he was showing her right now. His expression wasn't soft exactly, but there was something in it that she couldn't categorize. Something that didn't belong in a ballroom, didn't belong in the professional space between a boss and his assistant, didn't belong in any framework Elena had ever used to understand Adrian Moretti. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He didn't do anything. I was about to." Adrian's gaze moved briefly to her elbow, where Damien's hand had nearly been, and then back to her face. "You saw it." She had. She didn't deny it. "I was handling it." "I know you were." A silence stretched between them. Around them, the ballroom was carefully returning to the business of pretending nothing had happened. The quartet resumed. Conversations restarted. Elena was aware of eyes tracking them from every direction. Quick glances disguised as social movement. The calculating attention of people who made their livings watching power dynamics. "Why did he approach me?" she asked. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. "Because he understands where I pay attention." She processed that, filed it next to everything else she'd been filing for 2 years. "And do you?" she asked. "Pay attention. To me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Go finish your work, Elena," he said quietly. I'll have Marcus stay close to you for the rest of the evening." He walked away before she could respond, which was, she suspected, the point. She watched him move back into the crowd, watched the way people unconsciously shifted to give him space, watched the way Damien Russo from across the room tracked Adrian's movement with the focused attention of a man doing math. She felt cold, and she didn't think it had anything to do with the temperature. Marcus Chen had worked security for Adrian Moretti for 11 years, which meant he had the particular gift of being present without being obvious about it. He materialized at Elena's shoulder 20 minutes after the confrontation and stayed there for the rest of the evening like a very large, very professional shadow. Elena didn't insult him by pretending she didn't notice. "Does he always do this?" she asked at one point while they stood near the door watching guests say their goodbyes. "Do what?" Marcus said in the voice of a man who knew exactly what she meant. "Deploy people," she said, "like chess pieces." "Mr. Moretti is thorough." "That's not an answer, Marcus." He almost smiled. Almost. "No," he said. "Not always." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. The gala ended at 11. By 11:30, the room was clearing. Catering was packing down the tables, and Elena was doing her final walkthrough with a clipboard and the particular exhaustion that came from 6 hours of logistics management in heels. She had 17 things left on her checklist. She was working through them methodically, the way she worked through everything, when she heard Adrian's voice from the corridor outside the main hall. Not raised. Never raised. But carrying the way voices do when the speaker isn't concerned about who hears. "She stays out of this, Marco. I don't care what it takes." A pause. Someone else speaking Marcus, she thought, or someone like him. "Then make it possible. That's what I pay you for." She stopped in the middle of the corridor. She wasn't supposed to have heard that. She knew it the way she knew a lot of things instinctively from 2 years of learning the difference between what Adrian said in meetings and what he said in the spaces between meetings. She stayed out of this. She knew what this was. She had always known in the particular way that an intelligent woman knows things she's not supposed to acknowledge knowing. She knew what the red-flagged files meant. She knew what the conversations that ended when she entered a room meant. She knew what the security around Moretti Industries that went 3 layers deeper than any legitimate company needed meant. She had never asked. Because asking would mean acknowledging. And acknowledging would mean making a choice about what to do with the information. But standing in that corridor with the echo of Adrian's voice in her ears, she felt the choice she'd been avoiding for 2 years sitting right in front of her. She turned around and walked back to the ballroom. She finished her checklist. She said goodnight to the catering manager and the venue coordinator, and Marcus Chen, who materialized again to walk her to her car, with the kind of casual professionalism that didn't feel casual at all. She drove home through the Chicago streets with the radio off and her mind running like a machine she couldn't turn down. She was almost home when her phone buzzed. A text. From a number she didn't recognize. "He can't protect you from everything, Ms. Whitmore. Some doors once noticed can't be closed. Ask Adrian what happened to the last woman he tried to protect." She sat in her parked car for 40 seconds. Then she sent a screenshot to Marcus Chen with a single question. "Is this you testing something or should I be concerned?" Marcus called her back in 30 seconds. "Inside," he said. "Now, don't stop moving until you're in your apartment with the door locked." She was already moving. She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and she let herself do the thing she'd been carefully not doing for 2 years. She let herself look. Not at anything she could get in trouble for. She wasn't going to break any laws tonight. But there was plenty available in public records, in business filings, in newspaper archives, in the particular language of court documents that stopped before they reached conclusions that told a story if you knew how to read it. She knew how to read it. By 3 in the morning, she had a picture of Adrian Moretti that was much more complete than the one she'd been working with. Not because he'd hidden things from her. She'd always known she was working with an incomplete portrait, but because she'd finally stopped looking away from the edges. He was exactly what people said he was. She couldn't pretend otherwise, but he was also other things. The Elena Whitmore Scholarship Fund, established 7 years ago, administered through a non-profit at arm's length from everything connected to the Moretti name. She'd heard of the fund every year it sent 8 kids to college. She hadn't known who funded it. The medical bills for the family of a man named Caruso. She found that in a court filing referenced obliquely paid anonymously for 11 years after the man had been killed in a warehouse fire that her files suggested might not have been an accident. The hospital wing. The rebuilt community center in Cicero. The anonymous donations to 3 domestic violence shelters that appeared in financial records because someone had made a clerical error connecting a subsidiary to the gifts. She stared at the screen for a long time. She'd spent 2 years telling herself that Adrian Moretti was complicated, that the answer to what he was fell somewhere she couldn't quite reach from where she was standing. She was starting to understand that the answer was in front of her and had been for a while. He was a man who had done terrible things and spent years quietly trying to pay for them. She didn't know what to do with that. Her phone lit up at 3:47. Adrian. Not a text. A call. She stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings before she answered. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." A brief silence. "Marcus told me about the text." "I figured." "Are you all right?" She thought about lying. She thought about the professional distance she'd spent 2 years carefully maintaining. She thought about the space between an employer and his assistant that was supposed to stay clear and uncomplicated. "Who was she?" Elena asked. "The last woman you tried to protect." The silence that followed was the longest Adrian had ever left in a conversation with her. She'd timed his silences before professionally observationally, and she knew what each length meant. Brief was thinking. Medium was deciding. Long was something he hadn't planned for. This was the longest one she'd ever heard. "Her name was Julia," he said finally. "She was someone I cared about, 8 years ago. What happened to her? She was used against me." His voice stayed even, completely, unnaturally even. By people who understood that the fastest way to break someone isn't to threaten them. It's to threaten what they love. Elena's chest was doing something she didn't have a clinical name for. "Is that why you keep me at a distance?" she asked. "Even when it doesn't make professional sense?" "Elena, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking a direct question because someone sent me a threatening text message tonight, and I think I deserve a direct answer." Another long silence. "Yes," he said. One word. Said in the voice of a man who had just handed over something he couldn't take back. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Yes, Adrian. Okay." She picked up her cold coffee and put it back down. "That means I understand. It doesn't mean I agree with the strategy, but I understand the reason. The strategy isn't negotiable. I'm not negotiating anything tonight." She stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the empty Chicago street. "But I want you to know something." She kept her voice steady. Professional. The way she kept everything about herself when it came to this man. "Keeping me in the dark doesn't protect me. It just means I'm walking around without information I need. And I'm not the kind of person who walks around without information I need." A silence. Then, "I know." "So think about that," she said. "Good night, Adrian." She ended the call before he could say anything else, which was, she suspected, the most effective thing she'd done all evening. She stood at the window for a long time after. The street was quiet. The city was doing its nighttime thing, never entirely still, never entirely asleep. Somewhere out there, Damian Russo was also awake, also thinking, also calculating. And Adrian Moretti was sitting in his office. She knew it as certainly as she knew her own name, because he was always there at this hour, with the phone still in his hand, and something in his chest he hadn't expected to feel. She didn't know what happened next. She didn't know what Damian Russo wanted. Not really. She didn't know what the text message meant, or what the last woman was meant to warn her about. She didn't know what the distance Adrian kept between them was worth, now that she understood. It wasn't professional, had never been professional, and was in fact something much more complicated and much more dangerous. She knew one thing. She wasn't going to look away from the edges anymore. and whatever was coming. Whatever Damian Russo had set in motion by walking toward her in that ballroom tonight, she was going to face it with her eyes open. Even if Adrian Moretti had to be convinced that was the right decision. Even if convincing him took everything she had. She was very good at her job, and she was starting to understand that the job was bigger than she'd been allowed to see. She showed up to work the next morning at 7:45. Not because Adrian had called. Not because Marcus had texted with instructions. Not because anything about the previous night had resolved itself into something manageable. She showed up because Elena Whitmore had never once let fear dictate her schedule, and she wasn't about to start today. The Moretti Industries building was already running when she arrived. It always was because Adrian's operation didn't sleep any more than he did. She took the elevator to the 14th floor, set her bag down at her desk, powered on her computer, and started going through the morning briefing documents the way she did every single day. Normal, professional, controlled. She was on her third document when Adrian's office door opened. He stood there for a moment, just looked at her. She could feel the weight of it without looking up. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early." A pause. "Elena." "The Callaway meeting is at 9, she said, eyes still on the screen. "You have 17 unread flagged emails. The quarterly report needs your signature before noon. And your 2 o'clock asked to move to 3:30, which I approved because you have a gap anyway." She finally looked up. "Is there something else?" Adrian studied her face with the focused attention he normally reserved for contracts he didn't trust. "We need to talk," he said. "We are talking." "Not about the schedule." She held his gaze. "I know." He stepped back from the doorway. An invitation, or as close to one as Adrian Moretti ever got. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked into his office. He closed the door. She sat across from his desk, the way she had 1,000 times before. But something about the room felt different this morning. Smaller, maybe. Or more honest. He didn't sit. He stood behind his chair, both hands resting on the back of it, and he looked at her the way she imagined he looked at problems he was trying to solve without breaking them. "The text you received," he said. "It came from a number we've traced back to someone inside Russo's organization. It wasn't random. I didn't think it was. He sent it to tell you something specific. Not to threaten you, not yet. To make you ask questions." His jaw tightened. Questions he calculated I wouldn't want to answer. He was right about that part. "Elena, you told me about Julia last night," she said. "That was the first honest thing you've told me in 2 years that didn't come with a file attached." She kept her voice even. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. "I've been your assistant for 27 months. I've seen things in that time that most people in this city would pay a significant amount of money to know. I have never once, not once, done anything with that information except my job. And you still don't trust me enough to tell me when I'm in danger. It's not about trust." "Then tell me what it's about." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that had texture to it. "If I tell you everything," he said carefully, "then you're inside it. Right now, you're adjacent. There's a difference." Damian Russo doesn't think so. No. Something moved behind his eyes. He doesn't. "So the distinction you're drawing," she said, "only matters to you." He didn't answer. Which was, she'd learned sometimes more telling than anything he said. She leaned forward slightly. "Adrian, someone told me last night to ask about the woman you couldn't protect. That means Damian Russo is already using me as a pressure point. I'm already inside it. Whether you want me there or not, I'm there. So the question isn't whether to tell me. The question is whether I'm going to be navigating this blind or with information." He looked at her for so long that she counted her own heartbeats. "Damian Russo and I have history," he said finally. 12 years. We were on the same side of things for about 3 of those years, and then we weren't. He moved around the chair and sat, which meant he'd made a decision. She'd noticed that he processed standing up, and he committed sitting down. "He's been building a case against me for the past 2 years. Not a legal case, a leverage case. He wants control of 2 shipping operations I own in the Midwest. He can't take them by force. I have enough protection that a direct move would cost him more than it's worth. So he's been looking for a different kind of pressure. Me, she said. You. He said the word like it cost him something. He noticed you 14 months ago. I became aware of his interest 6 months after that. She absorbed that. You've known for 8 months that he was watching me. Yes. And you didn't say anything. I increased your security. I restructured which meetings you attended. Adrian. Her voice was steady. You moved me around the board without telling me I was on one. He stopped. She watched his face do something complicated, not defensive, not apologetic, something more genuine than either of those. Something that looked uncomfortably like a man recognizing a mistake he'd made with entirely good intentions. Yes, he said quietly. I did. The admission sat between them. Okay, she said. So what does he actually want specifically? Adrian looked at her for one more beat. Then he opened the desk drawer and slid a folder across to her. She opened it. The first page was a surveillance photograph. Her outside a restaurant 6 weeks ago. The second was her car in a parking structure time-stamped on a Tuesday morning she could place exactly because she'd been running late. The third was a document and internal financial summary she recognized immediately because she had prepared it herself. Her hands went very still. That document is proprietary, she said. Yes. The only people with access to that version are you, your CFO, and me. Yes. She looked up slowly. He has a source. He has a source, Adrian confirmed. Someone inside this operation. Someone with access to financial documents and apparently my assistant's daily movements. His voice stayed controlled, but she'd spent 2 years learning the edges of his control, and she could hear what lived just underneath it now. That's the problem I've been trying to solve for the last 3 months without letting whoever it is know they've been identified. Because if they know you know, they disappear, and Damien loses his window, which means he stops being patient. He pressed his palms flat on the desk. Right now, he's being careful. He wants leverage, not war. The moment he loses his inside source, that calculation changes. Elena closed the folder. She sat with it for a moment. All of it. The photograph of herself outside a restaurant living a normal Tuesday with no idea she was being documented. The financial summary she'd built on a Thursday afternoon passed somehow through hands she hadn't known about, to a man sitting across a city who was using it to plan around her. She felt something harden in her chest. Not fear. Something with sharper edges than fear. You should have told me, she said. I know. I could have helped. I know that too. He said it quietly. I was trying to keep you out of it. How did that work for you? He almost smiled. It wasn't a happy expression, but it was real. Not well, he said. She stood up, smoothed her jacket, and picked up the folder. I'm going to need everything you have on the source investigation, not a summary everything, and I want the full file on Damien Russo's recent movements. She headed toward the door. Elena? She paused. Why? He asked. It was the most unguarded thing she'd heard him say in 2 years, a one-word question that was really asking something much larger. She turned to look at him. Because someone photographed me outside a restaurant and put it in a file, she said. And I don't let that go without understanding why. She held his gaze. And because you've been carrying this alone for 3 months, and I've been sitting 15 feet away the entire time. She paused. Neither of those things is acceptable to me. She walked out. She had 17 things on her agenda for the day. She added 2 more. The files arrived on her desk by 10:30. Marcus Chen brought them personally, which told her Adrian had decided something. Marcus only hand-delivered things that weren't supposed to go through any system. She thanked him, closed her office door, and started reading. By noon, she understood the shape of the problem much better than she'd wanted to. Damien Russo was not a simple man. She'd known that from the flagged warnings in his file, but a flagged warning was a headline. What she was reading now was the full article. He'd spent 12 years building an organization that operated in the space between legitimate and criminal, with the particular skill of someone who understood that the most dangerous place to operate was the line where laws became ambiguous. He had lawyers, he had politicians, and he had relationships in federal offices that gave him advance warning when anything pointed in his direction. And he had, according to the 3-month investigation, Adrian had been running quietly, at least one person inside Moretti Industries, who had been feeding him information for approximately 11 months. Elena read through the list of people with access to the documents Damien had obtained. 12 names, including her own at the bottom, because Adrian's investigator was thorough enough not to exclude anyone. She looked at that for a moment. She wasn't offended. She would have done the same thing. She started working through the list methodically, the way she worked through everything, not with suspicion, but with attention. She'd spent 2 years watching people inside this organization. She knew who was careful and who was sloppy. She knew who was ambitious and who was content. She knew who had financial pressures. They didn't talk about who had relationships that complicated their loyalties, who had the particular look of someone managing something they weren't showing. She'd noticed things over 2 years that she'd filed away without knowing she was filing them. She was pulling those files out now. By 1 o'clock, she had it narrowed to 3 names. By 1:45, she had it narrowed to 1. She sat back in her chair. She picked up her phone and called Adrian's direct line. "My office," he said before she could speak. He'd seen her name on the screen, and he already knew she had something. After 2 years, he knew what her calls meant. She was at his desk in 90 seconds. "Daniel Marsh," she said. Adrian went very still. "He's been your CFO for 4 years," she continued. "He has access to every financial document I flagged in Russo's possession. His wife had a health crisis 14 months ago, I remember, because I arranged the flowers Adrian sent, which means I remember the timeline. 14 months is when the information started moving. He has a second phone. I've seen him with it twice in the elevator, in a context that didn't fit. And his request to move the 2 o'clock meeting today came in at 8:17 this morning, 12 minutes after I arrived and logged into the system." She set the narrowed-down file on his desk. "He wanted to know what time I got in." Adrian stared at the file. He didn't touch it. "You got this from the documents I sent you," he said. "In 3 hours. 2.5. Another silence. She watched him process what that meant, not just the information, but the fact of it. The fact that she'd been sitting outside his door for 27 months and had just done in 2.5 hours what his investigative team hadn't managed in 3 months. "I can't move on this yet," he said. "I know, if Marsh disappears or gets spooked, Russo changes his approach. I need to know what Russo's planning first." His voice had shifted the careful measuring quality she associated with him, thinking 3 moves ahead. "If I move on Marsh now, Russo goes dark and I lose the window. So we let Marsh keep feeding him," she said. "But we control what he feeds him." Adrian looked at her. She kept her expression neutral, professional. But she felt the precise moment when something in his eyes changed. When he stopped seeing her as the person 15 feet outside his door and started seeing what she actually was. "Misinformation," he said. "Specifically misinformation that tells Russo exactly what you want him to believe about your position right now." She sat down across from him. "He thinks he has insight into your operations. We let him keep thinking that. We just make sure the insight is wrong in exactly the right ways." Adrian leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. "You've been thinking like this the whole time," he said finally. 2 years. "I've been doing my job," she said. "My job involves understanding how this organization works. It was inevitable. Most people in your position would have used what they knew. I'm not most people. No." He said it quietly, with a weight to it that she felt more than heard. "You're not." She held her ground, kept her posture, kept her voice level, kept every professional safeguard in place the way she always had. It was getting significantly harder to do that, and she knew it, and she strongly suspected he knew it too. "I need you to do something," he said. "What?" "I need you to act as if nothing has changed. In your behavior with Marsh, with the rest of the team, with every part of your daily routine. If he's reporting to Russo on your movements, any deviation could signal that something is wrong." "I can do that. It's not simple. Marsh is going to be watching you specifically. Russo flagged you as a priority. Adrian. She met his eyes directly. I have been professionally normal in every situation this organization has ever put me in. I can handle this. He nodded slowly. I'll have a modified financial document ready by end of day. False projections on the Eastern Corridor properties. If Marsh passes it to Russo, we'll know for certain he's our source, and Russo will position himself based on wrong information. And once we confirm, he said carefully, we move to the next problem, which is Russo himself and what he's planning to do when he realizes I'm not as vulnerable as he thinks. She stood. I'll be at my desk. She was halfway to the door when he said her name again. She turned. He looked like a man who had started several sentences and stopped each of them. Like someone who had a particular kind of training years of it in not saying things out loud and was currently at war with that training. Thank you, he said finally. It was not what he'd started to say. She knew that. He knew that she knew it. You're welcome, she said, and walked out. The rest of the day ran with the particular intensity of work that mattered. Elena went through her routine with the careful precision of a woman performing completely ordinary professional tasks who happened to be acutely aware of every person around her. She smiled at Daniel Marsh when he passed her desk at 2:15. She answered his question about the rescheduled meeting pleasantly made. The appropriate small talk noted the way his eyes moved to her computer screen for just a fraction of a second and away again. She filed that fraction of a second carefully and said nothing. Marcus appeared at her shoulder at 3:30 and walked with her to the parking structure without explaining why, which she'd stopped needing, explained. At 4:45 her phone lit up with an unknown number. Not the same one as last night. Different. She sent it to Marcus without answering and kept walking. At 6 o'clock, she was the last person on the floor other than Adrian, whose office light was still on because it was always still on. She knocked twice her knock, the one he recognized, and opened the door. He was on the phone. He glanced up, held up one finger, and she stood and waited. The way she'd waited 1,000 times in 2 years. Except tonight, the waiting felt different. Charged with something she hadn't put a name to yet. He ended the call. Marsh sent something at 5:48, he said without preamble. From his secondary device. We've confirmed the channel. The document will be in Russo's hands by morning. She nodded. So we know. We know. His voice was quiet. And now we have a window. What does Russo do when he gets the document? He'll believe I'm in a weaker position on the eastern properties than I am. He'll calculate that a move on those assets is lower risk than he thought. He'll want to meet. Adrian stood moved to the window, looked out at the city, the way he looked at everything, like he was reading it. He'll want to negotiate from a position he thinks is strength, which means he'll want to move quickly before I realize what he knows. And you'll agree to the meeting? Yes. A pause. He'll want it somewhere he controls, somewhere that gives him a psychological advantage. Don't let him choose the location, she said immediately. He turned, looked at her. If he chooses the location, she said, he's already started controlling the narrative. Make him come to you. Make him sit across a table in a room you own and feel the advantage he thinks he has start to slip. She kept her voice even. Men like Russo depend on momentum. If you take momentum away from him before the meeting starts, you've already won half of it. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Where did you learn that? He asked. From watching you, she said simply. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a category for. Go home, Elena, he said, and take Marcus. I know. She picked up her bag. Adrian. She paused at the door. Whatever happens next, the meeting, Russo, all of it. I need you to stop deciding alone what I should and shouldn't know. That's not a small ask. I know what size it is. She held his gaze. I'm asking anyway. She walked out. She made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking slightly, not from fear exactly. From the particular physical response to being in a situation that mattered more than any situation she'd been in before, and knowing that the next thing that happened was going to change something permanently. She didn't know yet what thing. She just knew the change was coming. The elevator doors opened. Marcus was waiting in the lobby. "Car's out front," he said. "Thank you, Marcus." He walked beside her to the door. "He hasn't had anyone he talked to like that," Marcus said in the careful voice of a man who'd decided to say exactly one thing, and no more, since Julia. Elena didn't respond, but she thought about that all the way home, and for most of the night after. The modified document landed in Damien Russo's hands at 6:43 in the morning. Adrian knew, because he had people watching the channel now, not interfering, just watching the way you watch a fire. You've decided to let burn because you need to see where it spreads. Marcus confirmed the transfer at 7:01. By 7:15, Elena was at her desk with her coffee, her morning briefing, and the knowledge that the trap had been baited. Now they waited. Waiting was the part most people got wrong. They waited nervous, which meant they moved wrong, talked wrong, gave themselves away in the small involuntary ways that intelligent observers cataloged without even trying. Elena had watched Adrian wait for things before watched him sit completely still through 2-hour negotiations while the other side exhausted themselves performing patience they didn't have. She'd admired it professionally. She understood it differently now. She was doing it herself. Daniel Marsh arrived at 8:50. He stopped by her desk the way he always did. Pleasantries, schedule questions, the comfortable routine of a man who believed his cover was intact. Elena smiled and answered everything he asked and told him. Adrian's afternoon was light, which was true, and watched him absorb that information with the particular micro-expression of someone filing it away for a purpose she wasn't supposed to see. She saw it. She smiled wider and handed him a message from the legal team. He walked away, and she turned back to her computer, and her hands were perfectly steady. Good. At 9:40, her desk phone rang. Internal line 1 she recognized. "He's moving," Marcus said without introduction. "Russo's assistant called our front desk 3 minutes ago requesting a meeting. Formal channel. Said it was regarding investment opportunities in Midwest logistics." Midwest logistics, Elena repeated. The false document. Russo had read it, believed it, and was already reaching out. How soon? They suggested this week, Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. Fast. Russo was eager, which meant the false information had landed exactly where they needed it. "I'll let him know," she said. She knocked on Adrian's door with the update 60 seconds later, and watched his face do the thing it did when a plan was executing correctly. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the focused stillness of a man who had been braced for impact and felt the angle shift in his favor. "Thursday," he said. "They'll push for a neutral location. They'll get our East Conference room." He was already reaching for his phone. "Tell Marcus I want 4 people on the building that day. Quiet. Nothing that reads as defensive." "And Marsh." Adrian's expression shifted fractionally. "Keep him exactly where he is. I don't want him spooked before Thursday." She nodded and left. She was almost back to her desk when she heard Marsh's voice around the corner, low, faster than normal, with the clipped quality of someone having a conversation they didn't want to have at work. She slowed without stopping, kept her footsteps at the same even pace, said Thursday yes, the meeting is confirmed. A pause. "Because I confirmed it myself. The Eastern projections are exactly what you said they'd be. He's operating at a 30% deficit on those properties, and he doesn't want anyone to know it yet." Another pause, and then something that made Elena's blood run cold. "I know. She's the one thing I can't guarantee. She notices too much. If she's in that meeting..." Elena rounded the corner. Marsh saw her immediately. The phone went to his side in a movement that was just slightly too fast. She smiled at him. Easy, unbothered. The smile of a woman who had absolutely not heard a single word of that conversation. "Daniel, I was just coming to ask, did the legal team's message have everything you needed?" His recovery was good. She gave him that. "Yes, all set. Thanks, Elena." "Great." She kept moving. She walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water. She didn't need, stood at the counter for 30 seconds, and then walked to Marcus's station near the elevator. "Marsh just called someone," she said quietly. "From his personal phone in the hallway. He specifically mentioned me. He said I noticed too much, and he can't guarantee my behavior in Thursday's meeting. Marcus's face didn't change. You're sure? I'm sure. I'll pull the building phone logs for his floor. I used his personal phone, not the building system. But the call was recent, last 4 minutes. She kept her voice flat, professional. He's not just a source, Marcus. He's actively managing Thursday's meeting on Russo's behalf. That means Russo is going to walk in knowing more than the false document. He's going to walk in with a strategy that accounts for the real room. Marcus was already texting. I'll tell him. Tell him one more thing. She held Marcus's gaze. Whatever Russo's planning for Thursday, it's not just a negotiation. Marsh said he can't guarantee me. That means Russo asked him about me specifically. He's not coming to negotiate logistics. He's coming for leverage. Marcus's phone was already at his ear. Adrian called her into his office 4 minutes later. I was standing when she got there, not pacing. Adrian never paced, but standing in a way that said he'd been sitting until very recently and had needed to not be sitting anymore. Walk me through exactly what you heard, he said. She did, word for word. 2 years of professional precision meant her memory was exact. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the ventilation system. He said you noticed too much, Adrian said finally. Yes. And that he can't guarantee you. Yes. Something moved in his jaw. That's not the language of a source. That's the language of a handler. I know. Russo has had Marsh managing his access to this organization, not just feeding information, actively shaping what happens. He turned away from her briefly. 12 years I've known Damian Russo. I knew he was thorough. I didn't account for this level of embedded operation. He's had 11 months, Elena said. And he picked the right person, someone close to financials, close to scheduling, close to the daily mechanics of how you operate. She paused. He didn't pick Marsh randomly. Someone told him who to target. Adrian turned back. Their eyes met. Someone who knew your organization well enough to know who the vulnerabilities were, she said carefully. Before Marsh. Someone who understood the internal architecture. Adrian said nothing. But she watched his face do something complicated and slow the expression of a man recalculating a timeline and not liking what the new numbers produced. How far back does this go? She asked. Longer than 11 months, he said quietly. If I'm right about what I'm starting to think. He moved to his desk, pulled open a lower drawer, and withdrew a folder she'd never seen before. It wasn't from the filing system she maintained. It was older, the kind of thing that had been held somewhere private, somewhere off the organizational grid. I've had a secondary concern for about 6 months. Someone I didn't want to name until I had more certainty. He set the folder on the desk, but didn't open it. If Russo had a pre-existing source, someone who knew my structure well enough to identify Marsh as a viable entry point, there's only a small number of people that could be. Do you know who it is? I have a suspicion. His voice was careful. And I very much hope I'm wrong. He still didn't open the folder. She didn't push. Some doors, she understood, had to be opened on the person's own terms. What does this change about Thursday? She asked instead. Everything. He straightened. If Russo's walking in with a real strategy, not just confidence from false projections, then the conference room isn't the battlefield I planned. He'll have a counter to whatever position I take. His eyes moved to her face. He'll have information about how I operate under pressure, what I prioritize, what I won't trade away. A pause. He stopped. She waited. He'll know what matters to me personally, Adrian said. And he'll come prepared to use it. The silence that followed had the particular weight of something both of them understood completely, and neither of them said. He's going to use me as a pressure point in the meeting, she said flatly. He's going to try, then let him. She said it before she'd finished deciding to. If that's what he's planning, let him try. Because if he plays that card in a room full of witnesses in a meeting on your territory on the record, she leveled her gaze at his, then he's given you exactly what you need to take him apart. Adrian looked at her. You want to be in the room, he said. I'm always in the room for your meetings. This isn't a regular meeting. No. It's a meeting where the other side is planning to use my presence as leverage. which means my presence is the one thing that gives us real-time information about exactly what he knows and how he's planned to use it. She kept her voice even. I'm not asking you to put me in danger, Adrian. I'm asking you to let me be useful. He was quiet for so long that she heard the building breathe. If anything goes sideways, he started. Marcus will be in the room. That's not what I was going to say. What were you going to say? Another long silence. I was going to say that if anything goes sideways, he said quietly, I need you to trust me. Not argue with me, not make an independent call. Trust me. She looked at him steadily. I can do that, if you do the same. He held her gaze. Deal, he said. It was the first time in 2 years she'd heard him use that word like it meant something personal. Wednesday passed in controlled intensity. Elena ran her day normally. Marsh stopped by twice, each time slightly more casual than the visit before, which she recognized as calibration. He was testing her affect, making sure she wasn't running hot or cold, feeding his assessment back to whoever was listening. She gave him nothing but competent pleasantness both times. She spent the afternoon rereading everything in Russo's file, with the new layer of understanding, not just who he was, but how he worked, how he moved people. The Julia situation, which she now had more details on, showed a particular pattern. He didn't act fast. He set conditions. He arranged circumstances so that when he finally made his move, his opponent was already compromised, already off balance, already missing something they needed. He did it slowly, patiently, over months. She looked at the timeline. 14 months of Marsh. 8 months of Adrian knowing about it and managing his response. 6 months of a secondary concern Adrian hadn't named. 2 years of her working 15 feet from the center of all of it. She sat back. She looked at her own timeline. She'd been hired 27 months ago. By the standard HR process, vetted and interviewed, and offered a competitive salary, and had accepted because the position was exceptional, and she was very good at her job and hadn't thought twice about the name on the door. Who had recommended her for the interview? She sat very still. She already knew the answer. She'd known it the day she got the call. A professional contact, someone she'd worked with 3 years prior, who'd said a name had crossed his desk, and he thought she'd be perfect. She pulled up her professional contact directory, found the name, cross-referenced it against the Russo file. She found the connection in the 3rd page of corporate affiliations. Her hands went very still over the keyboard. She'd been placed here, not hired. Placed. She sat with that for 4 full minutes. Let the full shape of it settle. Let the implications line up and show her their faces. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. I need 5 minutes with him, she said. Right now. And Marcus, come in from the side. Don't pass Marsh's office. Marcus appeared at her elbow in 90 seconds. They walked to Adrian's office together, and she closed the door herself. Adrian read her face immediately. What happened? I was placed here. She set her phone on his desk, with the cross-referenced search visible. 27 months ago. The contact who recommended me for this position has 3 corporate affiliations connected to Russo's network. It took me 11 minutes to find it in public records. She held his gaze. I need to know if you knew. The silence that followed was the kind that either destroyed things or clarified them. No, he said. I didn't know when I hired you. He looked at the phone. I found it 4 months ago. She absorbed that. 4 months, she said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I didn't tell you. He confirmed with the particular honesty of a man who isn't going to make excuses, because I'd already spent 3 months watching you and being certain, more certain than I've been about almost anything, that you didn't know. That you were exactly what you appeared to be. And because telling you meant telling you that you'd been used, and He stopped. I didn't want to do that to you. She stood there. She knew she should be angry. She had every right to be angry. This was the second significant thing he'd known and chosen not to share with her in the name of protecting her, and she'd already made clear how she felt about that pattern. But looking at his face right now, at the precise quality of the discomfort in it, the specific kind that wasn't about him at all, but entirely about her, she found that the anger had edges she couldn't quite reach. They put me here to watch you, she said. They put you here, he said carefully, to be close to me. Whether watching was the original purpose or just the opportunity, I don't know. But you have been completely clear from every angle I've checked in 4 months. Something in his voice shifted. Which is not a coincidence. You're exactly who you are, Elena. Whatever Russo intended when he arranged your hire, you didn't comply with it. Because I didn't know about it. Because it's not who you are. He said it quietly, absolutely. I've watched you for 27 months. You don't have a version of yourself that operates differently when you think no one is looking. You are the same person at 7:45 in the morning that you are at midnight on a phone call. He held her gaze. That's rarer than you think. She looked at him for a long moment. He's going to use this Thursday, she said. When he realizes I know when he sees my face and understands I've figured out how I got here, he's going to use it. He'll tell me in front of you that you knew I was placed here and didn't tell me. He'll try to make me feel like I've been managed by both sides. Yes. Adrian didn't insult her by denying it. That's exactly what he'll do. And you're telling me now so that move doesn't work. I'm telling you now because you deserve to know 4 months ago and I made the wrong call. He held her gaze. But yes, also so that move doesn't work. She almost laughed. Not from humor, from the particular sensation of a situation being exactly as complicated as it looked, and somehow more honest for it. All right, she said. All right. Don't keep doing it, she said. Don't keep deciding alone what I should know. That's the deal I'm offering. She picked her phone up from his desk. I'll be at my desk. She walked out. She sat down. She took one steadying breath. She'd been placed here by an enemy's network 27 months ago, worked in honest good faith every day, and somewhere in the middle of that had become the most trusted person in a room that trusted almost no one. And tomorrow, Damien Russo was coming to use all of that against Adrian. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. Thursday arrived with the particular stillness of a day that knew it mattered. Elena was in at 7:30. Marcus had 4 people in the building visible only to her because she knew what she was looking for. The conference room was set by 8 clean formal deliberately positioned, so Adrian's seat faced the door. Home ground, every detail of it controlled. Marsh arrived at 8:50 and stopped by her desk, and this time she noticed something she hadn't seen before in his visits, something very slightly off in the timing of his smile. The way it arrived a half-second late, like a man who was performing easy while internally running calculations. He knew something was different today. She gave him nothing. Warm, professional, ordinary. Russo arrived at 10 on the dot. I had 2 men with him, associates, both watching the room, the way people watch rooms when they've been told to watch rooms. He was dressed exactly as he'd been at the gala, polished smooth, the particular elegance of a man who used his appearance as a tool. He shook hands with the reception staff. He looked around the lobby with the open appreciation of a man who wasn't the least bit intimidated by where he was standing. His eyes found Elena first. She was standing near the conference room entrance with a folder tablet and the calm expression of a professional doing her job. She met his eyes without looking away. Smiled the company smile she'd practiced since her first week. He smiled back. And there was something in it, a recognition, an anticipation that she filed instantly. He'd planned for her. He was pleased she was here. Good. Let him be pleased. Adrian appeared from the corridor 60 seconds later. No grand entrance, no performance. He simply walked in at the speed of a man who was exactly where he'd planned to be and had no reason to hurry. He extended his hand to Russo, and they shook with the practiced courtesy of men who had done this before across very different tables. Damien, Adrian said. Adrian. Russo's eyes moved briefly to Elena. I see you still have your indispensable assistant. She keeps the building running, Adrian said simply, and gestured toward the conference room. They filed in. Elena took her standard position tablet notes, the professional role she'd filled in this room 100 times. Marcus settled near the wall, which was also standard. Russo's 2 associates stayed at the back. The meeting opened with logistics. Russo's formal interest in the Eastern shipping corridor. The projection numbers from the document, Marsh had fed him the careful opening moves of a negotiation that both sides already knew was about something other than shipping. Elena watched Russo work. He was very good. He built a false foundation of genuine interest, specific questions, real financial literacy, the performance of a man doing legitimate business, while everything he said was constructed to test Adrian's position, to probe for the cracks the false document had suggested were there. Adrian matched him exactly. Controlled, patient, giving away nothing while appearing to give away reasonable ground. They were 22 minutes in when Russo shifted. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the energy of the room, the particular atmospheric drop that precedes a move. "I'll be direct," Russo said, and set down his pen. "I think we both know this conversation is larger than logistics." "I know what conversation I'm having," Adrian said. "Good." Russo looked at him evenly. "Then you know I'm not here to take anything from you, Adrian. I'm here because I think we're at a moment where two intelligent men can reach an arrangement that benefits both sides without anyone losing anything they can't afford to lose." He paused. "You're in a more constrained position than your public profile suggests. I have resources that could address that constraint. All I'm asking is partnership." "Partnership," Adrian repeated. "In specific defined operations, the Eastern Corridor, 3 Midwest shipping contracts, nothing that changes your core organization." Russo's voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man making a rational offer. "I'm not your enemy, Adrian." "You've been running a source inside my organization for 11 months, Adrian said, still conversational, still unhurried. "Daniel Marsh, who I'm aware you spoke with from this building this morning." The temperature in the room changed. Russo didn't flinch. But he recalibrated. She saw it, a micro-adjustment in his posture, a slight change in the quality of his attention. He'd expected to be ahead of this conversation. He wasn't. "I like to be informed," Russo said. "I know." Adrian leaned back slightly. "I also know that the document Marsh sent you 3 days ago was prepared specifically for you. The Eastern Corridor projections are significantly better than what you read. I'm not in a constrained position, Damien. I let you think I was." A silence. Then Russo smiled. The first genuine expression she'd seen from him, real unpracticed, the smile of a man who appreciated the move, even as it landed against him. "You've gotten sharper. I've had better information." Adrian said it simply. Russo's eyes moved to Elena. She kept her face completely neutral. "Your assistant," Russo said, and his voice changed, not threatening, more like a man finally turning to the card he'd been holding. "Do you know how she came to work for you, Adrian?" "Yes," Adrian said. One word. Said without a pause, without a tell, without anything that gave Russo the crack he'd aimed for. Russo's smile stayed, but its quality shifted, recalculating again. "She came through my network. You know that." "I do." "And she's still here." "She is." "That doesn't concern you." "Not particularly." Adrian's voice was level. "Because I've spent 27 months watching her work, which is approximately 27 months more data than you have on the subject." He met Russo's eyes directly. "Elena is here because she's good at her job, and I trust her judgment. Whatever you intended when you arranged her hire, it didn't take. Which tells me your read on people is less accurate than your reputation suggests." Elena kept breathing, kept her expression professional, kept every muscle in her face calm. Russo turned to look at her directly. "You knew," he said to her, "that I arranged the recommendation." "I do now," she said. "I found it yesterday in publicly available corporate records. It took 11 minutes. A beat." "And you're still sitting in that chair," Russo said. "I work for Adrian Moretti," she said. "Not for you, and not for whoever you thought you were placing here 27 months ago." She held his gaze. "Whatever file you have on me, Mr. Russo, I'd suggest it needs updating." The room was very quiet. Russo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. Something had shifted in his face. Not defeat, not yet. But the recognition of a man who had built a careful structure and walked into a room to find it, had been quietly, completely reconstructed around him. "You're in a different position than I thought," Russo said to Adrian. Yes. Adrian agreed. Because of her. Adrian didn't answer that, which was, Elena thought, the most precise answer possible. Russo picked up his pen, set it down again, looked at the table for 3 seconds that felt much longer. I want to talk about what a real arrangement looks like, he said finally. Not the one I came in here planning, a real one. That's going to require a different conversation, Adrian said. One that starts with Marsh and the secondary source you've had in place for longer than 11 months and everything those two people have given you. He paused. Full disclosure, from your side, before I put anything on the table. The silence stretched. Elena watched Russo make a calculation she could almost see in real time, weighing what he'd lost, what he still held, what it was worth to him to continue pressing against a position that had just been revealed as significantly stronger than he'd believed. Give me 48 hours, Russo said. You have until Monday morning, Adrian said. After that, the conversation we have is a different one. Russo nodded once, stood, buttoned his jacket. You've built something solid here, Adrian. His eyes moved to Elena one more time, not hostile, not calculating anymore. Something that might almost have been respect. Both of you. He walked out. His two associates followed. The door closed. The room held its breath for 3 seconds. Then Marcus let out a slow, controlled exhale from the wall that Elena suspected was the most visible emotion she'd ever seen from him. Adrian looked at her. She looked back. You didn't react, he said, when he asked if you knew. I told you I could handle it. You told Damian Russo his file on you needed updating, Adrian said quietly. In the middle of a negotiation where he thought you were his leverage. He was wrong about what I was. She kept her voice even. I thought it was worth clarifying. He looked at her for a long moment. Elena. His voice had that quality again, the one she didn't have a category for. That was Monday morning, she said, standing up and gathering her tablet. You gave him until Monday. She moved toward the door. I have some ideas about that. Give me an hour. She walked out. She made it exactly to the water fountain in the hallway before her legs went slightly unreliable, and she had to stand still for a moment, with one hand on the wall, and breathe. She thought about how she'd looked at Damian Russo and told him his file needed updating. She thought about Adrian's face when she'd done it. She thought about 27 months and what she'd understood now that she hadn't understood before about the specific way this man trusted people and what it meant that she'd spent 27 months becoming the exception. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she straightened up, smoothed her jacket, and walked back to her desk. She had work to do, and they had 48 hours. The hour Elena asked for turned into 3. Not because she was slow, because what she found when she started pulling threads on the secondary source was significantly larger than she'd expected, and she was not the kind of person who brought Adrian Moretti a half-finished picture. She sat at her desk with the Russo file. The internal access logs Marcus had quietly pulled for her, and the particular quality of focus that came from knowing the clock was running. 48 hours. Russo was somewhere in the city right now, also thinking, also recalculating, deciding whether Monday morning meant a real disclosure or a different kind of move entirely. She didn't give herself the luxury of worrying about which one. She worked. The secondary source had been Adrian's unspoken concern for 6 months. The folder he hadn't opened in front of her. The name he'd said he hoped he was wrong about. She'd respected the boundary in the moment. Some doors on their own terms, but boundaries had expiration dates when the clock was running, and this one had expired. She pulled the access logs for the 18 months before Marsh had been identified, filtered for documents that had later appeared in contexts connected to Russo's network, cross-referenced against the small pool of people with the organizational knowledge to identify Marsh as a viable inside placement. The number was small, 6 people. She eliminated 4 of them in 40 minutes. Alibis of the professional kind, verifiable access conflicts, the simple math of who had been where when certain information had moved. 2 remained. One of them was a man named Victor Hale, senior legal counsel. 11 years with Adrian, which meant he'd been present for Julia. Present for the period 8 years ago, when Adrian had lost someone, because enemies had understood where he paid attention. Present for the aftermath. The way a man rebuilds himself after that kind of loss. The specific shape of the walls he constructs where the gaps are. Victor Hale knew exactly where Adrian's gaps were. She stared at his name on her screen. She thought about this folder Adrian hadn't opened. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "Is Victor Hale in the building today?" A pause. "He's in the East Wing. Why?" "Pull his external communication logs for the past 18 months. All of them. I need to see them in the next 20 minutes. A longer pause. "Elena, that's... I know what it is. Tell Adrian I'm asking." She kept her voice steady. "Tell him I think I know who the folder is about." She heard Marcus exhale. 20 minutes, he said. She was in Adrian's office in 15. She set 2 pages on his desk. Not the full analysis, she knew how to read a room, and this room needed the headline first. "Victor Hale," she said. Adrian looked at the pages. He didn't move for 5 seconds. Didn't touch them. "Show me," he said. She walked him through it. Point by point. The access timeline. The organizational knowledge required to identify and cultivate Marsh. 3 external communications from Hale's legal account that routed through a shell firm with 2 degrees of separation from Russo's network. Not proof on its own, but directionally clear when stacked against everything else. Adrian listened without interrupting. She'd noticed early in their working relationship that he did this complete silence when he was absorbing something significant. No performative reactions, just processing. It had unnerved her in the first month. Now she understood it as the highest form of his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 11 years, he said. "I know." He was in the room when Julia... He stopped. "I know," she said more quietly. He stood up, moved to the window. She gave him 30 seconds that felt much longer, and then he turned back. "How certain are you?" 85% on what I can verify. The remaining 15% needs access to his personal communications, which I don't have legally and won't suggest we pursue illegally. She held his gaze. "But the behavioral pattern is consistent across 18 months, and the access timeline fits. If I'm wrong in a way that will be provable quickly. If I'm right, if you're right, then Russo has had someone inside my legal structure for 18 months. His voice was still controlled. But she'd learned the edges of his control, and she could hear what was underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. The specific pain of a betrayal from someone who'd been trusted completely. He would have known about our federal disclosures, our liability exposure, every legal strategy we've run in the last year and a half. Yes, and he came into that conference room this morning knowing all of it. Which is why he wasn't more rattled when his financial leverage didn't land, she said. He had backup. He just didn't lead with it because he thought the placement angle would destabilize me first. Adrian turned that over. "I was saving Hale," he said slowly. "The financial document was the opening. I was supposed to be off balance from that. Then he'd use your history, the placement, to drive a wedge. And if none of that worked, he still had 18 months of legal intelligence in his back pocket," she finished. The room was very quiet. "He's patient," Adrian said. "He's very patient, which means these 48 hours aren't a good faith gesture." She kept her voice flat and clear. "He's using them to decide whether to activate Hale." Adrian looked at her directly. "If Hale goes to Russo with our full legal exposure before Monday, then Monday's conversation isn't a negotiation, it's a surrender." She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "We need to move on Hale before he moves. Moving on my senior legal counsel requires having enough to make it clean and having it done before Russo realizes we're doing it." She stayed at the desk steady. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing else," he said. You've already done the hard part." He reached for his phone. "I need to make 2 calls. Give me an hour." She nodded and stood. "Elena." She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression she still didn't have a clean category for the one that had been appearing more frequently in the last 3 days and was becoming harder to file under professional. You should know that I've had Victor in that folder for 6 months because I couldn't make myself name it. 11 years. He paused. You named it in 3 hours. She held his gaze. Sometimes being outside something lets you see it more clearly. Sometimes, he agreed. And sometimes the person inside it just isn't ready to look. She left before she said something that crossed the line she'd been carefully not crossing for 27 months. The 2 hours that followed had the particular tense quality of a machine running at full speed in a soundproofed room. From the outside, the floor looked completely normal. Elena ran her afternoon schedule, handled 3 calls approved, 2 documents, and had a pleasant 4-minute conversation with Daniel Marsh, who stopped by at 2:40 to ask about Friday's meeting calendar. She told him Friday looked light. She watched him absorb that and leave. She watched the elevator doors close behind him. She turned back to her screen and saw the text from Marcus Hales in the building. Adrian's ready. She kept working. That was her job right now, keep the surface completely still while everything underneath it moved. At 3:15, Victor Hale was called into a meeting with Adrian and 2 people Elena had never seen before, but whose quiet, precise manner and the specific way they positioned themselves in the room told her everything she needed to know about who they represented. She didn't watch. She was at her desk working. She heard nothing from that room for 41 minutes. At 3:56, the 2 people she'd never seen before walked out of the building without speaking to anyone. Victor Hale did not walk out with them. He stayed in the conference room for another 20 minutes, and when he finally came past her desk, his face had the gray, hollowed quality of a man who had just had the floor removed from under him. He didn't stop at her desk. He went directly to his office, and she heard very quietly the click of his door closing. Marcus appeared at her shoulder 3 minutes later. Done, he said simply. Confirmation. Enough. He paused. More than enough once Adrian put what you found in front of him. Hale didn't hold for long. Does Russo know yet? Not yet. Adrian's controlling the timing. He needs to know before Monday, she said. But not so early that he has time to build a new position. Adrian said Sunday evening. Marcus looked at her with something in his expression she rarely saw from him. Something that might have been admiration if Marcus Chen had been the type to wear admiration on his face. You see it the same way he does. I've been watching how he thinks for 27 months, she said. It was inevitable. She went back to work. The weekend was quiet in the particular way that precedes things that aren't quiet. Elena went home Friday evening and spent Saturday doing the ordinary things a person does when they've decided they aren't going to sit still and wait for anxiety to find them. She cleaned, she cooked something that took too many steps to allow her mind to wander. She called her sister in Columbus and talked for an hour about her sister's kids and her sister's garden renovation and everything except what was actually filling up her chest. Her sister asked near the end of the call if she was okay. Working through something, Elena said. Work something or someone something. She almost said just work. Both, she said instead. Her sister knew her well enough not to push. She sat with it Saturday night. Let herself actually sit with it for the first time, instead of filing it under professional distance and moving on. She thought about Adrian's face in every version she'd cataloged over 27 months. She thought about what Marcus had said in the lobby. He hasn't had anyone he talked to like that since Julia. She thought about the specific way he'd said she isn't an asset in a crowded ballroom, like those 3 words were the most obvious and non-negotiable thing in the world. She thought about the fact that she had been placed in his orbit by an enemy's network and had spent 27 months becoming entirely on her own terms the person he trusted most. She didn't know what to do with any of it. She knew what she felt. That part was no longer something she could successfully argue with herself about. What she didn't know was what it meant in the context of a man who'd lost someone he'd loved because loving her had made her a target. A man who had spent 8 years building walls with the specific architectural intention of making sure that never happened again. She thought about what it meant that the walls had developed something that looked increasingly like a door. She went to bed without resolving any of it. which was she suspected exactly where they both were. Sunday evening. Adrian called Russo. She wasn't on the call. She didn't need to be. She got the summary from Marcus afterward delivered in his characteristically precise way. Russo had been informed that Victor Hale had provided a full account of their arrangement, that Adrian had everything Hale had passed across, and that Monday morning's conversation was therefore significantly renegotiated before it began. Russo had been quiet for a long time on the call. Then he'd said, "You've dismantled everything I built in this in 72 hours. Adrian had said, "I had better help than you accounted for." Marcus delivered this last line with a tone that was as close to dry as he ever got. Elena absorbed it. Felt something warm and complicated move through her chest, that she filed under later, and kept moving. Monday morning arrived. She was in at 7:30. Adrian was already there. She could tell by the light under his door, by the particular quality of presence in the floor, that she'd learned to read the way some people read weather. She knocked. "Come in." How was at his desk. Not working, which was unusual, just sitting with his hands flat on the desk and his gaze on the middle distance. He looked for the first time in 27 months, like a man who had come to the end of a very long run and hadn't quite sorted out what happened now. She sat across from him. "How do you want to play this morning?" she asked. "Russo's going to accept terms." He said it not like a triumph, like a conclusion. "He doesn't have a viable play left. Hale is gone, Marsh is gone, and he knows I have documentation of both. He'll negotiate because it's the only path that keeps him from a position that's actively worse." "What terms?" "He pulls back from the Eastern Corridor entirely. He delivers documentation of everything Hale passed to him, which gives us the ability to assess any damage to our legal exposure over the last 18 months, and he stays out of my organization's orbit." He paused. "In exchange, I don't use what I have in a way that takes him apart publicly." "That's generous," she said. "It's practical." He met her eyes. "A war costs more than it's worth. I don't need to destroy him. I need him gone." She nodded. "What do you need from me this morning?" "To be in the room," he said simply. "The same way you've been in every room this week." "That I can do." A silence settled. Not uncomfortable, the particular comfortable silence that only exists between people who have spent enough time in each other's company that quiet doesn't require filling. "Elena." He said her name in the specific way that meant what came next wasn't professional. She'd identified that cadence about 4 days ago and had been filing it carefully ever since. "I owe you something." "You don't owe me anything. I did my job." "You did considerably more than your job." He held her gaze. "You found the source I'd been circling for 6 months and couldn't name. You held the room on Thursday when Russo played his hand. You gave me information every time I needed it and asked for nothing except honesty in return." He paused. "Which I should have been giving you from the start." "Adrian, I need to say this." His voice was quiet and completely clear. "I've spent 8 years building a very specific kind of structure. The kind where nothing gets close enough to matter in a particular way, because I know what happens when things matter in that particular way, and I know what it costs." He held her gaze steadily. "I've been telling myself for approximately the last 4 months that keeping you at arm's length was protection. For you." "And now?" she asked. "And now I've watched you spend 4 days doing things I've never let anyone close enough to do. I've watched you hold information that could have scared you and use it instead. I've watched you look at Damian Russo across a conference table and tell him his file on you needed updating." Something shifted in his face, not the guarded, careful shift she was used to, but something more unguarded than she'd seen from him outside of midnight phone calls. "And I'm sitting here understanding that I've been protecting myself from something I already trust completely." The room was very still. "That's a significant thing to say," she said carefully. "I know. We still have Russo arriving in," she checked her watch, 40 minutes. "I know." He didn't look away. "I'm saying it now because I'd rather it not be unsaid any longer. Whatever happens after this morning, whatever you decide you want, I'm not going to be the person who kept something important at arm's length for the wrong reasons anymore." He paused. Professionally, personally, however you want to define what this is. It's yours to define. She looked at him for a long moment. 27 months. Every version of his face. Every calibrated silence and careful distance and professional boundary he'd maintained, and she'd matched with matching care. Every time she'd filed something under later and kept moving. After this morning, she said. After Russo, after the terms are set, after the building is clear. She held his gaze. We'll finish this conversation. Something in his face shifted into an expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the guarded look. It wasn't the negotiating look, or the board meeting look, or any of the professional masks. It was simply relief. The uncomplicated, unperformed relief of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and just set it down. After this morning, he agreed. She smoothed her jacket and picked up her tablet. 40 minutes, she said. I'll have the conference room set. She walked out. She made it 6 steps into the hallway before the smile she'd been holding back arrived. She let it happen briefly, facing away from the door. Let herself have the 15 seconds of it. Then she straightened, composed her face, and walked to the conference room. She had a meeting to prepare for. Russo arrived at 10, exactly same as Thursday. 1 associate this time instead of 2, the reduced security of a man who no longer had the leverage to justify a show of force. He looked, she thought, like someone who had spent the weekend doing the same kind of reckoning she had. Arriving at conclusions he hadn't wanted to arrive at. Adjusting to a map that looked nothing like the one he'd been using. He shook Adrian's hand. He nodded at Elena with something that was genuine rather than calculated for the first time. The meeting lasted 53 minutes. Russo accepted every term. Not cheerfully. There was no performance of good sportsmanship, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. But cleanly. Without the maneuvering she'd watched him deploy on Thursday, without the angled approach of a man looking for another entry point. He gave them what they needed, and he took what he was offered, and he did it with the particular dignity of a man who had played a long game, lost it, and was choosing to lose it in a way he could live with. When he stood to leave, he looked at Elena one final time. Adrian told me on the call yesterday that he had better help than I accounted for. He said it without rancor, just as a statement of fact. He was right. I built that entire operation around a misread. He paused. I assumed that someone placed in a position like yours would become what they were positioned to become, given time and proximity. People generally become what they decide to become, Elena said. Given time and proximity. He almost smiled. Yes, he said. Apparently. He walked out. His associate followed. The door closed. Adrian looked across the conference table at her. Marcus from the wall looked at the ceiling, the way he looked at ceilings when he was privately satisfied about something. Well, Elena said. Well. Adrian agreed. The documentation he's sending over needs a full legal review. We'll need interim counsel while we identify Hale's replacement. She was already making mental lists. The Eastern Corridor contracts need a real assessment. The false projections we fed Russo don't reflect the actual position, and now that this is resolved, we need accurate numbers. And Marsh's departure needs to be handled carefully in terms of how it's communicated internally. People will notice. Elena. The board will also need a briefing, not detailed but enough to... Elena. He said it with a specific quality that stopped her. She looked up from her tablet. He was looking at her across the table with the expression she'd seen 40 minutes ago in his office, the unguarded one. The building is clear. She looked at him. She looked at Marcus, who was very deliberately studying the far wall with the focused attention of a man who was absolutely not in this room right now. She set her tablet down. So it is, she said. She walked around the conference table. He stood. She stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to be unambiguous, far enough to still be a question. I want to be clear about something, she said quietly. I'm not staying because of what happened this week. I'm not staying because of Russo, or because you trusted me with information, or because of any of the professional things that changed. She held his gaze. I'm staying because I've known for a long time what you are when the room is empty and you don't think anyone's paying attention. And I chose to stay every single day for 27 months because that man is worth staying for. I was quiet for a moment. I've known for a long time what you are too, he said. I just kept finding reasons not to say it. I know. She almost smiled. I filed it under later. How's later looking? Better, she said. Considerably better. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically quietly. The way he did everything that mattered to him. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, and she felt it through every professional boundary she'd ever constructed, felt it dismantle 2 years of careful distance in the span of 4 seconds. We have a significant amount of actual work to do, she said. We do, he agreed. Starting with interim legal counsel and the board briefing. Yes, and we're going to need to talk about how this changes the professional structure, because I am not going to pretend it doesn't, and I'm not going to navigate a changed situation without clear parameters. No, he said. I wouldn't expect you to. Tonight, she said. We talk about the parameters tonight. Tonight, he agreed. She squeezed his hand once and released it. She picked up her tablet, walked toward the conference room door, paused with her hand on the frame and looked back. I was still standing where she'd left him, and there was something in his face she was going to need a new category for. Something she suspected she'd been building toward for 27 months without fully understanding that's what she was doing. Adrian. She kept her voice professional. Even. The voice she'd been using in this building since day one. Yes. Good meeting. He smiled. It was the most real thing she'd seen from him in 2 years. No performance, no calculation, no careful management of what he showed and what he kept. Just a man smiling at the end of something and the beginning of something else. Yes, he said. It was. She walked out. The building was already running around her phones. Footsteps, the ordinary business of an organization continuing to function. She moved through it with her tablet and her morning list, and the particular settled feeling of a woman who had spent 27 months deciding one day at a time who she was in the most complicated situation she'd ever walked into. She knew the answer now. She'd known it for a while if she was being honest. She was the person who noticed the things nobody else saw. The person who stood in conference rooms and told powerful men that their files needed updating. The person who found the name in 3 hours that had been unspoken for 6 months and who showed up every morning at 7:45. Not because fear kept her there, but because she had decided to stay. She sat down at her desk. She started working. She had a lot to build. The parameters conversation happened at 7:15 that evening in Adrian's office with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee that both of them forgot to drink. Elena had spent the afternoon preparing for it the way she prepared for everything, not with a script, but with clarity. She knew what she needed to say. She knew what questions had to be answered before anything moved forward. She'd built her professional life on the principle that unclear structures produced unclear outcomes, and she wasn't about to abandon that principle because the situation had become personal. If anything, the situation being personal made the structure more important, not less. She sat across from his desk. He sat behind it. Same positions they'd occupied 1,000 times, but the air between them had changed, charged with the particular awareness of 2 people who had stopped pretending not to know what they knew. "I'll start," she said. "All right. I want to stay in my role." She held his gaze steadily. Not a different position, not a title change designed to create professional distance between us on paper. I'm good at what I do, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make anyone more comfortable. What changes is that we acknowledge what's actually happening, and we agree on what that means for how we operate. "I wasn't going to suggest you change roles," he said. "Good. Second, I report any conflict of interest the moment I see it. If a situation arises where my personal connection to you compromises my professional judgment, I say it out loud. I don't manage it quietly, and I don't pretend it isn't happening. That's exactly how I'd want it handled." Third, she paused. This was the one she'd turned over most. "I need you to keep doing what you started doing this week. Telling me things. Not managing what I know to protect me from information you've decided I can't handle. We operate as equals in the things that matter, or this doesn't work." He was quiet for a moment. That last one is the hardest one. I know it is. Not because I don't want to, because it's a pattern I've been running for a long time. He said it with the honesty she'd come to expect from him in the last 4 days. Unvarnished, unperformative. The specific honesty of a man who had stopped having the energy to manage his own image in front of her. Old habits with very deep roots. I'm aware of that, she said. I'm not asking you to be perfect at it immediately. I'm asking you to try and to let me tell you when you're slipping without making it a confrontation. You can do that. I can do that very effectively. She almost smiled. I've been doing a version of it for 27 months without either of us acknowledging what it was. He looked at her across the desk, and something in his face settled the particular settling of a man who has been waiting for something without letting himself fully believe it was coming. Is that everything? He asked. Those are the professional parameters, she said. The rest we figure out as we go. The rest, he said carefully, being the part that doesn't fit in a parameter document, she said, which I'm comfortable with as long as the structure around it is clear. He nodded slowly. Then we have an agreement. We do. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. Now, the interim legal situation. I have 3 names for replacement counsel. I want to walk you through them tonight before the board briefing tomorrow. He blinked. Just once. And then he laughed. She had never heard Adrian Moretti laugh in 27 months. Not fully, she'd seen the near smile, the dry half-exhale that passed for amusement when something struck him as genuinely clever. But this was an actual laugh, quiet and real and slightly surprised, like it had come out before he could decide whether to let it. It was the most disarming thing she'd ever heard from him. Of course, he said, composing himself. Walk me through the names. She did. They worked until 9:30. It was, she thought afterward, driving home through the city with the radio off and something warm and settled in her chest, exactly what she'd hoped it would be. Not dramatic, not complicated. Just 2 people who understood each other doing what they did well with the air between them, finally honest. That was enough. That was more than enough. The weeks that followed moved fast. The board briefing went smoothly. Adrian handled it with the particular skill of a man who knew how much to say and how to say it. And Elena sat in the room and watched the board members absorb the information about Hale and Marsh with the varying degrees of alarm and relief that came from understanding that a significant threat had been neutralized before it fully landed. 3 board members asked questions directed at her. Not at Adrian, at her. Specific questions about the identification process, the timeline, the decision-making in the conference room on Thursday. She answered each one directly and without deflection. Adrian, to his credit, didn't answer for her. Afterward, one of the older board members, a woman named Patricia Soames, who had been on the Moretti Industries board for 9 years and had the particular sharp attention of someone who had survived in that seat for that long, by reading rooms better than most, stopped Elena in the hallway. You've been in that building for over 2 years, Patricia said. Not quite a question. 27 months, Elena confirmed. And the Hale situation, you identified that in 3 hours. 2.5. Patricia looked at her with a measuring expression. I've been suggesting for 2 years that Adrian needed a strategic advisor who understood the internal architecture of this organization at a level that goes beyond executive assistance. A pause. I'd like to formally propose that role to the board. Elena held her gaze. That's a conversation I'd need to have with Adrian first, of course. Patricia's expression shifted into something that might on another face have been a smile. But I suspect he won't object. She didn't tell Adrian that evening. She let it sit for 2 days, turned it over, decided what she thought about it independently of what he might think, and then brought it to him on a Wednesday afternoon with the same directness she'd brought everything else. He was quiet for longer than usual. It's the right move structurally, he said finally. That's not a personal answer. Personally, he said. I've been thinking about it since Thursday. I just didn't want to be the one to suggest it because I didn't want you to wonder about the motive. She looked at him. Would the motive have been wrong? No. The motive would have been that you belong in a larger room than you've been sitting in. He said it simply, factually. But I've spent enough time making decisions about your professional life without your input. I wanted this one to come from you. She considered that. Accepted, she said. 3 months after the Monday morning meeting with Russo, Elena had a new title, a renegotiated contract, and an office 3 doors down from Adrian's, with a window that looked out at the same stretch of Chicago skyline he'd been looking at for 11 years. The work itself was what she'd been doing for 27 months, but expanded fully. Expanded given full access to the organizational thinking she'd been working alongside without being formally inside. She attended strategy meetings she'd previously prepared materials for. She contributed to decisions she'd previously only observed. She asked the questions she'd been filing for 2 years under later, and got the answers she should have been given from the start. It was not seamless. Change this significant never was. There were 2 board members who were politely skeptical. A senior operations director who had been with the organization for 14 years and was not accustomed to having his reasoning questioned by someone he'd previously thought of as the woman who managed Adrian's calendar. A cluster of middle management who watched the shift with the careful attention of people calibrating how the new structure would affect their own positions. Elena handled it the way she handled everything directly, without performance, with the particular patience of someone who understood that trust was built in specific moments rather than declared in general ones. She got it wrong twice. She moved too fast on a restructuring recommendation without properly reading the room it would land in, and she brought a concern to Adrian in a way that was too sharp and not enough collaborative. Both times, she identified the error herself before anyone told her and addressed it directly. The second time, Adrian told her quietly, "You don't have to be perfect." "I know," she said. "I just like being right." He smiled. "I've noticed." They were careful with the personal side of it. Not hidden, she wasn't interested in pretense, and neither was he, but careful. The building already knew in the way buildings know things, but knowing and watching were different, and she had no interest in giving anyone the impression that what existed between them had anything to do with how she did her job. So she was professional in every professional space. She was exacting and clear-eyed, and wholly without sentiment in every meeting, every decision, every moment that belonged to the work. And in the spaces that didn't belong to the work. The quiet evenings when the floor was empty and the city settled into its nighttime version of itself. The weekend phone calls. The occasional dinner where they talked about things that had nothing to do with logistics or strategy or the organizational architecture of a complicated organization. She let herself be something other than professional. It turned out she was good at that too. It turned out, actually, that being allowed to be a full person in the same space where she'd been a professional person for 27 months was something she hadn't known she'd been missing until she had it. She thought about that sometimes. How long she'd been working in a room where she kept a particular version of herself visible and filed everything else under later. How good she'd become at it. How unnecessary she understood now the filing had been. Later had arrived. She intended to make full use of it. 4 months and Marcus Chen knocked on her office door. She said, "Come in," and he stood in the doorway with the particular expression she'd learned to associate with him, having something to say that he'd spent time deciding whether to say. "Marcus." She set down her pen. "Sit down." He sat. He looked at the desk for a moment. "I've worked for Adrian Moretti for 11 years, he said. "I know. I was with him when Julia happened. I was the one who—" He stopped. "I was the one who had to tell him about what Russo's people had done to get to her." He said it quietly, without drama, the specific flatness of someone who has had a long time to live with a memory they don't revisit often. "I watched what that did to him, what he built afterward specifically to make sure nothing like that could happen again." She waited. "I want you to understand something," Marcus said. "Not because you don't already understand it, but because I think it needs to be said out loud by someone who was there." He looked at her directly. The walls he built, they weren't just about protecting himself. He genuinely believed that caring about someone was an active threat to that person. That being loved by Adrian Moretti was a liability. He paused. "He's carried that for 8 years. "I know," she said. "What you did these last months, but also before that, All 27 months of it, you didn't break down those walls. You just demonstrated consistently, and without announcement, that being known by you didn't make him more vulnerable. It made him sharper. Marcus held her gaze. I've watched that happen. I wanted you to know someone saw it. Elena held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, Marcus, she said quietly. He nodded once, stood. He doesn't say things like this, so I'm saying it instead. He walked out. She sat at her desk after he left and let that settle the full weight of it. The history of a man she'd been working alongside without knowing the complete shape of. 8 years of believing that who he was made the people he loved into targets. 8 years of building distance as protection. She thought about 27 months of showing up at 7:45 and doing her job and filing everything under later. She thought about how she'd walked into his world without knowing she'd been placed there, stayed on her own terms, and become without planning it, the person he'd finally stopped being afraid to trust completely. She thought about what Marcus hadn't said and didn't need to say that Adrian Moretti had spent 8 years alone in a very specific way and wasn't anymore. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The night that changed the last thing that needed changing happened, 5 months after Russo's Monday morning meeting on an ordinary Tuesday that announced itself as nothing special. They were in Adrian's office at 8:30 in the evening. Not unusually late, both of them ran long on Tuesdays, because Tuesday was when the week's most complex problems had fully developed and needed addressing. She had a quarterly report. He had a call scheduled for 9. She was going through the 3rd section of the report when he said her name. Not the professional version, the other one. The one with the weight in it. She looked up. Howe was looking at her with the expression she'd added to her catalog 5 months ago and still couldn't fully describe. The unguarded one. The one that appeared when the room was empty of everyone except the two of them, and he'd stopped maintaining the last fraction of the distance he'd never quite fully closed. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. The night of the gala, he said. When I walked across that ballroom and put myself between you and Damien Russo. He paused. I told myself it was protective instinct, professional duty, the standard response to a threat to someone in my orbit. He held her gaze. I'd been telling myself that particular story for a long time. Months, actually. How long? She asked. Longer than I was comfortable admitting. He set down the document he'd been holding. I knew what it was. I'd known for long enough that the knowing had become its own kind of weight. But naming it felt like loading a weapon I wasn't sure I should be carrying. She kept her voice steady. And now I'm tired of not saying the true thing. He looked at her directly, completely, the way he looked at very few things. I love you, Elena. Not as a function of what happened with Russo, not as a response to crisis, not as gratitude. I've been in love with you for most of the 2nd year, and I've been handling it very badly by any reasonable measure, and I think you probably knew, but I needed to say it out loud in a room with no agenda attached. The office was completely quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. You're right, she said. I knew. I thought so. I've known since about month 18, she said. I filed it very carefully and kept working. Something moved in his face, the relief she'd seen before, but deeper than before. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't mine to say. She held his gaze. That particular door had to open from your side. I wasn't going to push it. Even though you felt the same way. Even though. She set her own document down. I've been patient for 27 months, Adrian. 18 more wasn't going to break me. He looked at her. Do you know how rare that is? Patience. That specific combination, he said, of seeing someone completely the worst of it, the most complicated parts, and deciding deliberately to stay. He said it quietly. Not staying because you don't see it. Staying because you do, and you decided anyway. She stood up and walked around the desk. He stood. He always stood when she moved toward him. She'd noticed that some instinctive movement she'd come to recognize as specific to her, and she stopped in front of him close enough that the distance was gone. I love you too, she said. I've been telling you without words for about 9 months. I'm glad we got to the words. He reached up and touched her face, just that his hand against her jaw, the specific gentleness of someone who was being careful with something they valued completely, and she felt it dismantle the last of the professional architecture she'd spent 27 months constructing. She didn't mind. She'd built it well. It had held up exactly as long as it needed to. "We have a 9 o'clock call," she said. "I know. And the quarterly report isn't finished." "I know that too. So." She held his gaze. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. He didn't move his hand. Is it always going to be like this with you? Everything in its order. Everything at its proper time." "Yes," she said. "Is that going to be a problem?" "No." He smiled, the real one, the one she'd first seen on a Monday morning 5 months ago and had been seeing regularly since. "It's one of my favorite things about you." She stepped back, returned to her chair, picked up the quarterly report. She heard him sit back down. "Section 3, she said. "The Eastern Corridor numbers are better than last quarter by 14%. "Read it to me," he said. She did. The 9 o'clock call happened on time. The quarterly report was finished by 10. They both went home. And tomorrow came the way it does when you've stopped dreading it. Ordinary and full, carrying all its work and its complications and its demands and all the specific rewards of a life that has become finally the size it was supposed to be. 6 months later, the city still talked about Adrian Moretti the way it always had. The name still changed the temperature of rooms. Lawyers still returned his calls in 60 seconds. The restaurants still went quiet when he walked in. The reputation was intact and would probably outlast everything built on top of it. But inside the Moretti Industries building on the 14th floor, something had shifted in the specific, irreversible way that things shift when they've been rebuilt from the foundation. The Eastern Corridor was running at record numbers. The legal structure rebuilt under interim counsel and then under a permanent hire. Elena had vetted with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what that role required, was cleaner than it had been in years. The board was fully informed. The organization was leaner in the places that needed to be lean and stronger in the places that counted. And Elena Whitmore, who had walked into this building 27 months ago as an executive assistant placed there by an enemy who had profoundly misread the kind of person she was, now had her name on a strategic advisory role that gave her the full room she'd been working at the edges of for 2 years. She didn't think about the placement anymore. Not with anger, not with the particular cold feeling she'd had sitting in her car, looking at the cross-referenced search result. She thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as a miscalculation, so significant it had almost a kind of comedy to it. Damian Russo had looked at Elena Whitmore and seen a tool. He'd arranged her proximity to Adrian Moretti, expecting it to produce leverage, a source, a pressure point, a weakness he could exploit when the time was right. What it had actually produced was the one person in 27 months who'd gotten close enough to see Adrian Moretti completely and decided to stay. There was a particular justice in that, she thought. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Marcus Chen, for his part, had taken to occasionally nodding at her in the elevator with the specific gravity of a man silently maintaining that he had assessed this situation accurately from the beginning, which she suspected was not entirely false. She always nodded back. One morning, 8 months after Russo's final meeting, Adrian found her at her desk at 7:30 with her coffee and her morning briefing, and the particular focused expression she wore when she was 3 problems ahead of the current moment. He stopped. She looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He kept looking at her. "I was just thinking about something." "Tell me." He sat on the edge of the desk, in the way he did when he wasn't in his formal meeting mode, relaxed in the specific way that only appeared in her presence. She'd noticed the way a person is relaxed when they're not performing anything for the person they're with. "I've been thinking about what I said at the gala, the night this started." He paused. "Stay away from her." "I remember it. I said it," he said, "because Damian Russo was standing too close, and I felt something I didn't have a name for yet, and I reacted to it before I'd finished deciding whether to." He looked at her steadily. And I've been thinking that of all the things I've said in my life, in rooms full of people who were measuring every word, that was probably the most honest thing I ever said out loud." She looked at him. "Stay away from her," she repeated. "Because she was already mine to protect," he said. "Before I could admit it. Before I'd named it. Before any of this." He held her gaze. The instinct knew something the rest of me was still arguing about. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a more romantic interpretation of what looked at the time like territorial aggression," she said. "It was both," he said. "I'm not pretending I'm uncomplicated." "No." She almost smiled. "You're extremely complicated. And you stayed anyway. And I stayed anyway." She held his gaze. "Because complicated and worth it are not mutually exclusive. And because the most feared man in this city turns out to be underneath all of it exactly the kind of person worth staying for." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You changed things," he said. "Not just the organization, not just what happened with Russo, the actual structure of how I operate, how I think about what's worth protecting and how to protect it." He said it simply, without dramatics. "I was making myself smaller for 8 years in the name of safety. You walked into this building and made it impossible to keep doing that." "I didn't do anything except my job," she said. "You did your job so well," he said, "that I couldn't pretend anymore that the walls were necessary." He reached over and took her hand, the way he did now, quietly, without ceremony, the ease of something that has found its natural place. "You showed me the difference between building walls to survive and building walls instead of living." She looked down at his hand over hers. 27 months. Every morning at 7:45. Every filed-away moment. Everything she'd kept professional and steady and carefully at arm's length, because the moment hadn't come yet, because the door was still closed, because she'd understood somehow that some things were worth waiting for, if they were worth having at all. "We have a 7:45 briefing," she said. "In 15 minutes, he said. "I know. And the Harrington audit response is due by noon. I know that too." She turned her hand over in his, held it for the 15 minutes they had. Because that was what it looked like she'd learned. Not grand and cinematic. Not saved at the last second and swept off your feet. Just two people who had seen each other completely. The fears, the failures, the parts that weren't easy, and found that the seeing made them trust each other more, not less. Just someone who showed up at 7:45 and stayed. Just the right person in the right room at exactly the right time. At 7:45, she stood up, smoothed her jacket, picked up her briefing folder, and walked into the meeting. He was right behind her. The city still talked about Adrian Moretti. The way it always had, the ruthless man, the feared name, the reputation that walked into rooms before he did. But Elena Whitmore knew what the city didn't. She knew the version of him that existed when the room was empty and the performance was over. She knew the man who had spent 8 years believing love was a liability, and had been wrong, not recklessly wrong, not stupidly wrong, but wrong in the particular human way of someone who had learned a lesson from pain and held it too long past its usefulness. She knew the man who had said she isn't an asset in a crowded ballroom before he'd admitted it to himself, because the truth in him was faster than the fear. And she knew that the most important thing she'd ever done in her professional life wasn't identifying a source in 2.5 hours, or holding a room during a negotiation, or building a strategic advisory role out of a position that had been designed to use her. The most important thing she'd ever done was walk into a building at 7:45 on a Monday morning 27 months ago and decide without knowing she was deciding to be exactly who she was. Every single day. In every single room. Until the right person finally stopped being afraid to look. And that, in the end, was the whole story. Not a woman who saved a dangerous man. Not a man who rescued a woman from danger. Two people who saw each other, clearly chose each other deliberately, and built something out of honesty and trust, and the particular courage it takes to stay in a room when staying is the harder thing. The city went on the way cities do. And on the 14th floor of the Moretti Industries building at 7:45 every morning, Elena Whitmore walked in, set her coffee down, opened her briefing, and chose again and again and again exactly the life she had built. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. And that made all the difference.